Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to cover episodes 813 through 815, which will cover manga chapters 847 through 849. And all our heroes find themselves in some serious trouble with this set of episodes. So, synopsis: with Luffy Nami captured, they now have to figure out a way to break free while Brook and Pedro enact their plan to break into the treasure room to get the poneglyph rubbings. And at the same time, Chopper and Carrot are also in their own serious predicament of trying to break free of Brulee's capture as well. So, like pretty much every other episode in the Whole Cake Island arc, there are a lot of differences here. Thankfully, though, not nearly as many as the last set of episodes. But with this one, in episode 813, after Luffy makes his big challenge to Big Mom, the anime adds a whole sequence of Pedro going off and creating that distraction that he and Brook had talked about, as well as Tamago and Smoothie's response to it, with her deciding to leave to investigate. What was supposed to take place in this moment was a quick moment of them being alerted to Pedro's presence, and then Brook taking this moment to step to the door and declare that he is about to perform a special show, which has been moved to the end of the episode to be sort of the cliffhanger for episode 813. Later on, when we do get to the canon part of Pedro's distraction at the beginning of episode 814, it's of course elongated in the anime to almost triple the length it's probably supposed to be in the manga. There's also a scene added where Tamago figures out that Pedro is a decoy, but in the anime this happens off screen, so when the next time we catch up with Tamago and all of them, they're having a conversation that confirmed this suspicion, but him coming to that realization is never actually shown in the manga. Another one is the anime moves the scene up showing what is happening with Chopper and Carrot and what their plan is. In the manga, this doesn't happen till the following chapter after putting talks to Nami and Luffy. However, they decide to split this scene up. As in the manga, we actually get to see this entire sequence play out in one continuous scene. However, in the anime, it just stops short after Chopper activates Monster Point, and then we then go into sort of the other stuff. And then it moves the talking to Luffy and Nami scene in between this moment. I think this was mostly done because they wanted to have sort of a good break-off point with the anime. But what doesn't quite make sense is that if they had kept the original sequencing, they would have had that cliffhanger ending that the manga had. Because the chapter actually ends on the scene where Pudding kind of whispers something into the ears of Luffy and Nami and then kind of tearfully says goodbye, with Luffy kind of like hysterically saying, "What did you say?" That was the cliffhanger for the end of chapter, I believe it was 848. So they could have had a pretty decent cliffhanger as well, but for some reason they decided to move Brook's big moment towards the end of this episode, which I guess isn't a bad thing, but it does kind of it disrupts the flow of the fight between Carrot and Chopper and then Brulee for sure. Also, speaking of which, the scene with Luffy and Pudding and Nami, this is extended with some filler as well. The manga has a scene beginning with Pudding arriving where Luffy and Nami are being held, but the anime adds a few extra scenes of Luffy yelling at Opera and getting on his nerves a bit, which is not in the manga. Brook's fight scene in episode 815 is also greatly extended in the anime. In the manga, this scene actually begins where he picks up the key. So this essentially adds like 4+ minutes of filler to this fight. In the anime, there's a small scene also inserted in episode 815 showing the moment where Reiju is shot and wounded by some unknown person or thing, which also does not appear in the manga. In the manga, you see what happens at the end of this episode, where Reiju is already shot and struggling at the end of chapter 849, where she's kind of leaning up against the wall, all bloodied and battered. This scene just never made any sense to me why they added this over the manga, because it doesn't add anything. It doesn't really show you anything, like, because we could have guessed that she got shot based on how she's acting at the end of the chapter. So if the scene's not going to show you who shot her or in what situation she was shot in, it really just adds nothing of value to the story other than to pad out time, which again is just probably one of the most frustrating things about Whole Cake Island. Is just There's so much padding, and what's supposed to be already a very long and convoluted arc is made even worse with all these fillers that the anime adds. In any case, though, let's talk about what actually matters in these episodes. So picking up where we left off with Big Mom speaking directly to Luffy and Nami, she makes it abundantly clear that Luffy is beneath her and that it isn't even worth her time to address him face to face as a sign of intimidation and to kind of flex her authority and power. But despite that, to my surprise, she is willing to honor Sanji's request, provided Luffy gives up trying to get Sanji back. Like I mentioned in the last podcast, when Sanji made this deal, I thought for sure she would kind of go back on her deal somehow. But so far, she's seemingly honoring it and willing to genuinely and sincerely honor it. Although the end of this episode makes me obviously kind of a little wary about where she actually is in terms of like how she intends on honoring all of that. But the conversation then shifts to the events of Fishman Island, and she brings up the treasure that Luffy offered in exchange for eating all of her sweets back during the events of Fishman Island. And among that treasure, she reveals that Neptune had included the tamate box, or the tamate bako, which is one of the royal family's prized valuables and considered a national treasure of Fishman Island. At least so Big Mom thinks, because she thinks there's something of extreme value in there, which originally contained the energy steroids that Hody stole. But at the end of Fishman Island, it was revealed by the Minister of the Right that in case there was another break-in, he instead put explosives in it. So now when she goes to open and at the tea party, it will supposedly explode with a huge bomb. So now we have a Chekhov's gun situation where we know that the tamate bako has a bomb inside it that will go off at some point during the tea party, which creates this sort of anticipation for all of us when that moment arrives. The conversation shifts to Nami as Big Mom asks whether she actually killed Lola, but Nami tells her that Lola is actually her friend and that the Vivre card was given to her as a sign of friendship. And this takes a quick turn, as you'd think Big Mom may be concerned or at least curious how her daughter is doing. But upon hearing Nami say that Lola is doing well, this sends Big Mom into an absolute rage that even all of her other kids, including Perospero, are surprised by. Big Mom does not react well to the news that Lola is doing well and still considers herself part of the family. She goes even so far as to say that she wants her dead, and that if Nami knows where Lola is, to tell her so that she can send assassins to kill her, which, good lord, that is some animosity. I was curious as to why Lola had such a cheerful outlook on her mother's view of her, but then again, Lola wasn't the best at reading people's intentions and emotions, as we saw. But we get this kind of answered a little later in a scene with Pudding, which we'll talk about a little bit more. A couple of things, though, first, that stood out about this scene is first that the reason Big Mom is so angry, as well as why Lola left to go on her own, additionally also why she's so adamant about marrying for love, all these things were connected to how Big Mom operates her crew. So, like Pudding, Lola was set to be part of a political marriage that apparently would have given Big Mom access to power immense enough that had the marriage succeeded, it would have given her enough power to defeat Kaido, Whitebeard, and Shanks, the other three emperors, essentially. Oda had already planted the seeds in the last episode, or in the manga, it was literally in this same chapter, though we can infer that Lola was probably set to marry one of the giants. And that's really the only kind of political marriage that would have given her that amount of power. The best part, though, is even in this frankly terrifying and hopeless situation, Luffy still manages to aura farm like crazy while being bound and caged at the mercy of one of the most powerful enemies he's come up against so far. He just straight up tells it like it is, that the reason Big Mom isn't Pirate King yet is not due to Lola not marrying this person like she was supposed to. It's because Big Mom is the one who failed and is still too weak to do the impossible, which has become the Pirate King. And this was so freaking awesome. Luffy just doubles down on his challenge. And anytime this message and theme comes up, I love it because it's true. You can't blame others for your failure. Ultimately, it's on you to kind of figure it out. Obviously, you need support from others, but You can't keep blaming others for your failures. Nearby, Pedro starts his mission to cause a distraction and become a decoy, allowing Brook to more easily sneak into the treasure room, and this works as it draws out Smoothie and Tamago. Although, when you watch this in the anime, you wonder just how many sticks of dynamite that does Pedro actually carry around with him, because he's tossing them around like it's candy everywhere. Like almost every scene, he's just tossing sticks of dynamite everywhere, blowing things up. Like I think in the anime, you can probably count like a dozen sticks of dynamite that he's thrown just in that moment, and he's still throwing them out later. It's pretty funny. All the while, though, Sanji's stress chain smokes away his lungs from the stress of Luffy and Nami being in danger. And we've seen Sanji smoke whenever he gets stressed, but this is the first time I think we've ever seen him just smoke like this incredible pace. He is inhaling like every second. And you know, how Sanji maintains such incredible cardio and lung capacity is beyond me when he's smoking this much. But Sanji is beginning to suffer basically a mental breakdown. Between this scene and the scene from the last episode where he's kind of got his head between his knees, just praying for everyone to get off the island safely, it's hard to watch, like I said in the last podcast. But later on, you see him try to adjust to his new reality by forcing sort of the heart eyes for Pudding and getting excited to be with her and gathering flowers for her, as well as cook her dinner. But the reality is, in the context of One Piece and sort of Oda's storytelling, this is kind of a fate far worse than death. Sanji is basically in the process of mentally reconciling with the fact that he is having to give up his dream. He's trying to reconcile with no longer being able to be with his nakama and go find the all blue. And as stated by Oda in the past, one reason that he chooses not to kill off his villains is because they get to suffer a punishment far worse than death by losing their dream and not being able to chase that anymore, and being defeated by Luffy in a way where they can no longer go after their dreams is a fate worse than Luffy actually like killing them. Obviously, the other reason that Oda doesn't kill his villains, or anyone really, is that he's stated on multiple occasions that he wants to keep One Piece lighthearted and end each arc with a sort of a banquet and a party, and so you can't do that if you basically killing people left and right. Now, Pudding, on the other hand, is in her room having her wardrobe prepared when the maid mentions that Nami had Lola's Vivera card, and this brings up some thoughts and memories surrounding Lola and the concept of marriage. And I will admit, seeing this scene made Pudding a much more interesting character, as you know, my thoughts around Pudding at this time was that she had some ulterior motive, but this made me think, okay, maybe I was wrong. And if anything bad was going to happen, it was because Big Mom forced her to do it, not because Pudding herself had any sort of ulterior motives. Pudding seemed like she was close with her sister Lola, and it almost seems like she envied or even admired Lola's courage to defy their mother and chase after her dream of being able to choose her husband. And Lola truly believed that family meant that they would support you even if they didn't necessarily agree with you. But as we've seen, both Judge and Big Mom's idea of family is that they are there, or their kids are there to serve them and their own selfish interests. The part that always hits me is the part during Big Mom's tirade about Lola earlier, is how it implies that Lola and all her kids should be somehow indebted to her, and that their kids owe them something just for the sheer fact that they are their parents. And now, I'm not a parent myself, but it's my belief that you shouldn't have kids as investments or treat them as an investment. Sure, you'd like your kids to understand and appreciate the great sacrifices you as a parent make, but I'm of the belief that they necessarily don't owe you anything other than compassion, empathy, and respect, which is pretty much what you would like everyone to give you, frankly, as long as you've earned that. And I've always hated the idea and parents who hold it over their kids that they owe them something for like the roof that they provide for them, or food and clothes and stuff. It's like, you chose to bring this kid into the world. Of course, you as a parent should provide those things without creating some sort of debt. As if it's like, oh, I'm giving you these things, like you owe me something. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe I'm wrong, and that's why I shouldn't have kids. in which I don't really feel like having kids. But anyways, of course, I'm not saying that kids should be entitled or spoiled brats either, and that they should appreciate, respect, and feel gratitude for the sacrifice their parents make. But a kid should never be made to feel indebted to their parents for things that they are inherently responsible for doing when they have children anyways. And that is the difference between the bad parents in One Piece, like Big Mom and Judge, as opposed to parents like Zeph or Bellemere, which, by the way, both are not blood related at all to their respective children, and yet they sacrifice and do way more for their, adopted kids. And that is the other larger theme in this arc, that being related by blood doesn't necessarily make you family. And being a family, whether it be a found family like the Straw Hats, or adopted family like Zeph or Bellemere, these types of families are just as, if not more so, powerful and connected than blood related ones. It's at this point, though, the Charlotte members guarding Luffy and Nami are alerted by one of their younger brothers named Anglaise, who is apparently a reference to creme anglaise, an egg custard dessert. And interestingly, he's made to look like your sort of like traditional 50s and 60s style greaser biker gang member. I don't know where that comes from, to be honest. But while all of this is going on, Brook begins to enact his special live show, and he honestly has never been cooler. Brook manages to break into the treasure room and Brook tells us how the chess peacekeeper soldiers work. And I was genuinely surprised to learn that these guys weren't real people, but in fact another form of homies with souls implanted in them, thanks to Big Mom's powers. And when Brook makes note of that, it dawns on you as you read or watch that maybe Brook is somehow able to impact or manipulate them with his devil fruit. And also, being able to somewhat control souls with the Yomi Yomi powers, you'd think that this would be a great time to see if that works. And sure enough, we get this amazingly awesome and epic moment where he's able to summon this like ghoul-like ghost. And this somehow knocks the chess soldiers out, almost like he's overwhelming them with this sort of raw musical presence. And I still don't quite understand what is at play with how this aspect of Brook's powers work. And it's kind of difficult to really make conjectures since this fruit is largely made up, so Oda can do whatever he wants with it. For example, to me, it's not clear if music has anything to do with this ability. Like, is he able to attack the souls due to his music? Or does the music enhance the Yomi Yomi soul powers? Or are the soul abilities completely independent of music? He just chooses to use music as part of his attacks. I'm of the mind that the music does actually enhance his soul abilities. It somehow manages to, it allows him to channel his soul manipulation abilities and uses the soul solid attacks in a way where he can actually affect the souls, which is an interesting concept. I do hope Oda kind of develops this a little bit more, although, I mean, several arcs in further along than Hokikan, I still don't quite think Oda has utilized Brook's powers all that well. Although I will say he doesn't really utilize Brook all that much, but nonetheless, it's awesome to finally see Brook get some genuinely cool moments and a chance to shine. Like, he really lives up to his Soul King title here, as Brook has never looked so badass with that huge soul ghoul behind him as he takes on a small army. Now, he's eventually able to take down both the chess soldiers and the living Charlotte family member guards as well, in probably one of the coolest combat moments for Brook. Unfortunately, Brook hasn't really had the opportunity to do much in the story because when he's been kind of sidelined for much of it. And when you really think about it, he's really only had Thriller Bark, Fishman Island, and Punk Hazard to actually even be in position to make a solid contribution to the story. Like, when you really think about from the time he joins, you get the Sabodi arc, the Straw Hats are supposed to be overwhelmed and they lose. Then the entirety of the Ace rescue storyline, he's not in. So Amazon Lily, Impel Down, and Marineford, he's gone. He's just not even in the story, really. And then when you get to Dressrosa, he's separated from them almost like a third of the way into that arc. So Whole Cake Island is really his first chance to shine. And I'm really glad Oda is giving Brook some genuinely fun and awesome moments. Like here, we get to see a new Soul Solid move called the Swallow Bandolore. Now, a bandolore or a bandola is a musical term referring to that little flag or tail attached to the stem of notes in sheet music. It indicates its rhythmic value, such as turning a quarter note into an eighth or a 16th note. That's when you get like the multiple flags coming off of the end to indicate whether it's an eighth or a 16th note. I used to be able to read sheet music, and I played the cello as a kid. Now I probably couldn't do it. It's been so long. That was back in high school. But yeah, I'm assuming the name is referring to the fact that it leaves an ice trail on the back of its target that looks like a bandolore or a banderole on a note. And the swallow part, I think, comes from the fact that he himself is flying through the air when he performs it. But with that, Brook now has the keys to the treasure room. But tragically, though, Big Mom has arrived to personally take care of this intrusion and catches Brook in the act of breaking into the poneglyph cage. And it looks like Big Mom, seeing how unique Brook is, that she now wants him for her collection. One thing about this scene in the anime is they show Big Mom destroying the locked door to the room with some kind of power, but it isn't really shown what she actually did. And if this was some ability she has due to her devil fruit or whether it was some form of haki, it's hard to say. I say that it might be haki because it uses a similar sound effect and has the sort of the Conqueror's haki lightning, but it's pink instead of the usual black with red outlining. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the spoiler section though, but I mean, for the purposes of this arc, it really doesn't matter, but it is kind of funny looking back on this scene and comparing it to some of the knowledge we have about haki later on. Now, I'm not saying that it is haki or it isn't because this wasn't in the manga, so I don't even think Oda intended it to be this, so who knows? Now, moving over to Chopper and Carrot's storyline, we see that they're about to be boiled in some stew, but this was all part of Chopper's plan as they let Brûlé capture one of the mirror-cloned Carrots, who is actually a frog. And this was pretty genius, but even with Carrot kind of like screaming from above the ceiling, I don't know how they don't hear the frog and Carrot screaming differently. Like you hear Carrot screaming from like 10 feet above them, and then you have the Carrot frog, or the frog Carrot going ribbit ribbit over and over and over, like just suffering. And the fact that Oda chose a frog, I feel like is a reference to the whole saying, with the, a frog being slowly boiled won't realize it's being boiled alive. Even though this frog clearly knows it's about to be boiled. Thankfully, they enact their plan before Randolph cuts the rope and knocks Randolph out, with then Carrot spilling the boiling stew onto Brûlé, which, ouch, that's gotta hurt. They begin their counterattack and are able to take down Brûlé, Randolph, the Noble Croc, and a few other homies. But it's also nice to see that the frog was saved as well. But more importantly, though, they have now captured Brûlé and can now use her freely to traverse the mirror world, allowing them the ability to not only search very quickly, but also travel quickly all over the island. And I would assume that the entirety of Whole Cake, the archipelago as well. Pudding then eventually comes down to see Luffy and Nami and apologizes to them for not being able to keep her promise, and also how poorly her family has treated them thus far, but also to tell them that Sanji has in fact proposed to her. She then proceeds to tell them that she plans on not marrying him because he's just being considerate of her, implying that he's not doing this out of love or desire. But then she leans in close to whisper something we can't hear to them both, which completely changes their attitudes, as they have this sort of chillingly shocked face with Luffy giving off this panicked energy as she walks away tearfully saying goodbye. And I remember at the time myself and everyone was theorizing what she could have said to them that could cause this type of reaction. I think there were two camps really. My initial thought was just based on Nami and Luffy's reaction that this was something bad. Like Pudding basically told them that she was going to do something to Sanji, but I had no idea what. And like I've always said, I was always suspicious of Pudding pretty much ever since she showed up. And I think this was also a lot of the general sentiment around the fandom at the time too. The other prevailing thought that was also very popular is that due to the earlier scene of Pudding remembering Lola and her decision to defy Big Mom and kind of go her own way, that perhaps she was going to be on more of a favorable person and actually sacrifice herself to save them all. So the reaction of panic from the pair was that they just found out that she was going to die for them and that they were shocked at the revelation, which was a pretty good theory. And I think this was actually the sort of the direction that the story was supposed to make you think. And I was just a little too cynical having seen the Big Mom Pirates. They all seem pretty messed up and detestable, which is why I felt it was probably going to go in the bad direction. But yeah, it did leave things a lot up in the air. And at the time, I wasn't sure which way it would lean either, whether my initial reaction was correct or whether the more sort of set up direction was actually correct. So yeah, this was actually a genuine surprise when it was revealed for me which one was actually correct. But anyways, I don't want to talk too much about this because it might give you a spoiler as to like which one is the correct one. But there's a scene with the Vinsmokes discussing where Sanji is going to live once he's married, and Judge kind of mentions that they will live in Germa to make sure that they can use Pudding as a hostage should Big Mom ever try to double cross them. But I thought to myself, with how shrewd Big Mom and her crew have been shown to be thus far, that she must have some sort of plan in place to make sure that she won't be the short end of this deal. And so for me personally, it gave me some amount of pleasure knowing, despite how superior Judge seems to be feeling at this moment, you just know that Big Mom has something up her sleeve. And you see sort of seeds of that being planted with the reveal at the end of these episodes with Reiju, and which we will kind of discuss a little bit. But this then cuts to a scene with Sanji himself as he receives an update on the status of the Straw Hats from this man referred to as the Eggplant Soldier. Now, the funny thing about this is when Sanji proceeds to ask him about the requested ingredients, he also offers him a meal instead, if he's actually hungry, so that, because Sanji is royalty, and usually royalty don't cook for themselves. But he suggests eggplant to him, which Sanji immediately but politely declines. And this has a couple layers to it, because Zeph would often call Sanji Chibinasu, or little eggplant, as kind of an affectionate insult. And so this probably brings up thoughts of Zeph for him, which is something he really does not want to think about, since they are, they're still in danger. They're being held, well, they're not hostage, but they're being used as blackmail. Now, lastly, the chateau guards chase Pedro into the courtyard where Baron Tamago is waiting for him. And this is where we learn probably the biggest piece of information about Pedro and his past. We learned from Tamago that Pedro's old crew was called the Nox Pirates. Now, I won't talk about the reference and origin of this name because this will actually be discussed in the series at a later point. But the biggest reveal is that Pedro and Tamago have some connection due to their mutually shared eye scars, that they had some sort of a conflict the last time Pedro was here, and that Pedro came back to Whole Cake Island to essentially die, but not because of, some sort of a suicide to attack Whole Cake Island, but because Pedro doesn't have much left, as he has already given up 50 years of his lifespan, most likely to Big Mom's Soul Pocus ability, meaning we're going to get some form of a flashback explaining what happened and why this happened and why Pedro basically bet the little remainder of his life to help Luffy and the Straw Hats. Now, the more I learn about Pedro, the more I was beginning to like him when I was originally going through this part of the story. And I'd say it's at this particular moment is where I was like, okay, I am very interested in Pedro now because he seems really cool. And there is something special about him, or at least he believes in something special about Luffy. And that got me hyped. So yeah, but this episode closes on several cliffhangers. As all of our heroes, Luffy, Nami, Brook, and Pedro are all in pretty bad pinches, with only Chopper and Carrot being our lone sort of saviors. Now, Oda always does manage to kind of keep a little bit of hope alive throughout this arc, because whenever everyone is in trouble, he leaves like a section of the crew available to still be able to help. Because earlier, obviously, when everyone else was captured, Brook and Pedro were around. But now that Brook and Pedro are in trouble, Chopper and Carrot are now free to assist. However, now there's an added wrinkle and cliffhanger because Reiju is among the characters that are also in trouble. Now, at the time, I figured that there was some kind of plot to double-cross the Vinsmokes, just as we had sort of figured out with that conversation with Judge and his kids. And Reiju, being the only kind of semi-sane one of the Vinsmokes, probably found something and was confronted and has now been shot. However, we will have to wait till the next episode to find out what the heck this scene actually means and what she found out. But anyways, we'll leave it there, and if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. I really appreciate all of those, and I enjoy them. If you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing, because that also helps a lot too. Check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast if you want updates when I post new episodes, or to see some pictures of my manga collection. Check that out as well. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. Small spoiler section, just one little thing I wanted to kind of talk about when it comes to Big Mom. But yeah, if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! All right, so nothing too major, but the one thing I wanted to kind of mention was I mean, it's a filler scene, so it really doesn't matter, but I like to think that maybe that Big Mom was actually using, Advanced Conqueror's Haki, or Duo here. So Duo is the concept that was introduced in Wano by Hyogoro about using your Conqueror's Haki and injecting it into something and destroying it from the inside. So that's how obviously Luffy learns to being able to damage Kaido's incredibly tough durability and skin. And it almost seems like, yeah, that's what Big Mom is doing here. She like puts her hand on the door and like injects something into the door, and it just explodes. And the fact that it has a similar sound effect to Conqueror's Haki, I made me think maybe this is actually her using Duo to basically destroy the door from within. Because I have a hard time believing that the Soul fruit actually was the thing that did this. Like, did she just inject her soul into the door and made it explode? That might explain why the color of it is pink. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of choose to believe that this was actually one of the first examples of Duo being used, or Advanced Conqueror's Haki. But yeah, upon seeing this scene, after having seen the explanation of Duo during the Wano arc, you never know. And I think maybe that's a fun little headcanon that I have now. Anyways, that's kind of all I really wanted to talk about. So yeah, if you did enjoy that, thanks. And I'll see you on the next episode. See ya.